This video is for students who are looking for some modeling of how to analyze political cartoons. For this video, we will be using the worksheet created by the National Archives that you see in front of you, and the cartoon I'm going to be using as a model for this procedure is called School Begins, which appeared in Puck magazine in 1899 and is taken from day 1 of Unit 4 in our United States history curriculum. Let me first start off by elaborating on what is meant by a political cartoon. A political cartoon is an illustration that's main purpose isn't necessarily to entertain, like most comics or cartoons, although it might. Rather, its primary purpose is to spread awareness about an issue, challenge authority, or satirize or critique public officials or policies. They're really meant to expose the reader to an issue that the drawer, whose job title is called an editorial cartoonist, believes is important. And yes, sometimes this can be done through humor, exaggeration, mockery, or satire that at least some viewers find funny. However, other times it could be at the other end of the spectrum and deal with incredibly serious or heart-wrenching issues, and in this case, the artist's intention is more about reaching their audience through sympathy, anger, or shock. Before we get to that though, let's do a quick run-through of how this tool will help us better analyze a political cartoon. As with so many sources we use in history class to learn about the past, it really does pay to look at them multiple times, commonly with each time being for a slightly different purpose or lens in order to get a fuller understanding of its content or purpose. Political cartoons are no different, and we can see here that the first step is for us to quickly scan the cartoon and record what we notice first, as well as the title or any captions that also appear. A common technique used by editorial cartoonists is to use symbolism and hyperbole, or exaggeration, to emphasize their message, and often this is done by making important things seem really big or front and center so they catch the viewer's eye. Usually the first things that you notice are actually some of the most important to understanding the cartoon and the artist's message. Once your initial scan of the cartoon is done, take a closer look to observe its parts, which in political cartoons sometimes help to classify into words and visuals. This is where you will pay closer attention to the details that, while they may not be as pronounced, still could have a huge impact on the artist's message and how it is perceived by the audience. You'll see in my model in just a few minutes that I recommend you divide the cartoon into sections as you do this so nothing gets overlooked. While doing this, you are going to focus in on any labels, descriptions, thoughts, or dialogue boxes that appear, as well as people, objects, places, as well as the actions and activities you can see them doing. Once you've seen all there is to see, it's time to try to make sense of it. This is where you will apply your historical knowledge and skills to interpret the cartoon by determining the significance of words, any symbols that are used to represent something else, and also note any emotions that are portrayed. You will do all this to identify and evaluate the artist's message. And sometimes to really understand the historical context in which it was made does require a little outside reading or research. You might need to look up who the artist was, as well as some more information about an event, person, or group depicted in the cartoon. The last step is to use it as historical evidence. Basically, what did this cartoon inform you about that any other source might not have been able to? For instance, does this provide insight into how certain people viewed a historical event or person? Or what is special or unique about this artist's message? I'm now going to model this with you using a political cartoon from 1899 titled School Begins. Before we begin though, just let me come out and say that the ideas and depictions in this cartoon, while much more common at the time that it was made, are considered incredibly offensive, prejudicial, and overtly racist by today's standards. However, I did select this cartoon from Lesson 1 in Unit 4 because these ideas, as harmful and upsetting as they are, also really do inform us not only about the issues facing American society at the time, but also provide us insight into some of the United States' foreign policies and allow us the space to critically think about both. I will go out of my way to be as respectful as possible when analyzing this cartoon, but if you are feeling discomfort, distress, or anger, I do understand and recognize your feelings. So here it is. In my initial quick scan, I noticed that Uncle Sam over here, who is always used as a symbol of the United States or its government, appears to be yelling at several small children, who appear to be students in some sort of classroom. Which makes sense because down here I noticed that the title is called School Begins. That's my first impression of this cartoon, and I hope you see what I was mentioning before when I said the things that the editorial cartoonists really want you to see, they make larger and more in front to grab your attention. Now I'm going to take time to observe its parts and really focus in on the details. You'll notice that I did like I said I would, and that I divided it into sections, which are going to help me focus on each area separately so I don't miss anything. Also, I activated the magnifier tool of this app that's going to help us focus in and note and see some of the details that might be a little small for us. I'm going to start with this upper left quadrant, and over here I see a young man of color washing windows, and he's not in a seat like the other students. I also see the teacher right here, who, like I mentioned a moment ago, is Uncle Sam, and you know this because his pants are red and white striped just like the American flag, and he's wearing a blue coat. Also, he's holding what looks to be a stick or a pointer over, or even threatening with, a group of young students who I will get to in just a minute. In this section, I see offensive stereotypes of both Native American and Chinese American young people. Looking closer at the Native American, I can see that the book is upside down and he's wearing a blanket. And the Chinese American student is waiting at the door, not entering. There is writing on this back blackboard that says, and if we zoomed in, we can read it, but I'm just going to paraphrase it for you. It basically says that when England was establishing its empire, it ruled the places it colonized without the consent or permission of the indigenous people, and that these people were actually better off by being controlled by England because that actually helped advance their civilization. And it concludes with the argument that the United States should do the same thing with its new colonies, and that, here I'll pull it up, that the United States must govern its new territories with or without their consent until they can govern themselves. Moving on to the bottom right area, we see that it is full of what appear to be white students who are sitting perfectly and reading their books in the back of the classroom. And if we look closely, we can see that their books are titled Alaska, Texas, and California, which are some of the territories that the United States annexed either by purchase, conquest, or treaty. As we continue moving clockwise through this image, we make it to the front where we see several more students, all of color, who are labeled Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. And the student labeled as Puerto Rico even looks to be shrinking away out of fear, perhaps, from Uncle Sam. Oh, and let's not forget to take a look at the caption below the title down here, where it says Uncle Sam to his new class in civilization. Now, children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not. But just take a look at the class ahead of you and remember that in a little while, you will feel as glad to be here as they are. And if I flip back to my cartoon analysis tool, you will see that I've been entering all my noticings in the proper places as we went through this. So let's try to make some sense of this. In the entry for this cartoon on the Library of Congress's site, the editorial artist was listed as Louis Dalrymple, and it was published in Puck magazine in 1899. I couldn't find much more about him except that his cartoons were published in numerous periodicals of the time and that they commonly dealt with pretty controversial topics. Also, let me add some words and visuals that I found significant. I just looked up in my US history book what was happening in 1899, and apparently this was when the United States was expanding its overseas empire, and some historians call this period the Age of US imperialism. And some of the places that the United States got involved with or added as territories during this time include the 4 students symbolized here. Also, this was when many African Americans were trapped in the cycle of sharecropping, Chinese immigrants were forbidden entry due to the Chinese Exclusion Act, and Native Americans were still removed from their ancestral lands. So these are all things that I'm going to add to this question right here. Which, if I pull up the picture again, these 3 things are definitely symbolized here, especially with the Native American being isolated, the Chinese American not even being allowed in, and the African American doing manual labor instead of being able to learn. Let's conclude by determining what we can use this as historical evidence of. Well, I think this cartoon, which again is incredibly offensive and racist, does show the intersection of racism and imperialism. For an American magazine to publish a cartoon implying that the United States should imperialize other nations, and in this case the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, for their benefit just because it will help civilize and Americanize them, just like California, Texas, and Alaska did, is a very unique source that does provide us insight into attitudes of the time.